Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Brent Fuel, co-founder of the Water Finance Exchange, along with my colleague Hank Habicht, and I'm delighted to moderate today's conversation on regional solutions impacting the water sector. This is a conversation I've really been looking forward to have today. For those unfamiliar with WFX, we are a nonprofit dedicated to helping small and rural communities strengthen the financial health and governance of their water and wastewater systems by assisting them to access financing, technical expertise, and sustainable solutions. The scale of the challenge is significant. The U.S. has more than 148,000 public water systems, including 52,000 community water systems, and over 16,000 publicly owned treatment works. Many of these systems were built decades ago and now serve communities struggling with aging infrastructure, population decline, shrinking tax base, and escalating capital and operational costs. These pressures make it especially difficult for small systems to meet today's regulatory and investment demands. This conversation is more than just about pumps and pipes, however. It's about the economic well being and long term viability of communities and regions that depend upon shared resources. Today's webinar will explore how regional solutions, ranging from shared services, interlocal agreements, cooperatives, or full blown consolidation, can help utilities improve efficiency and expand their customer base and deliver more affordable, sustainable services. We'll also address real world hurdles and best practices that can guide successful regional partnerships. And I'm thrilled to be joined by three leaders with deep experience in making regionalization work. Andy Cricken is the managing director at Moonshot Missions, and he formerly led Camden County Municipal Utility Authority, where he oversaw the consolidation of 50 small wastewater plants into a single modern regional system. And Bill Teichmiller, CEO of EJ Water Cooperative, Illinois' largest regional water cooperative, who has transformed EJ into a national model for rural utility consolidation and service. And Tad Bohannon, CEO of Central Arkansas Water, which serves nearly 500,000 people across 17 communities and is widely regarded as one of the country's most successful regional water systems. Our guest will share what works, what doesn't work, and how communities can begin the journey toward regional solutions that deliver long-term benefits. And I just want to remind those who have dialed in today, we'll take questions. So feel free to submit yours through the chat function at any time, and we will get to those when we can. With that, let's get started. And I want to start with Tad.
Uh-oh.
Tad, what does regionalization mean to you and the communities you serve?
You know, that's a great question, but fundamentally regionalization boils down to, can different groups or different organizations work together to provide the best service and the highest quality at the most affordable rates, water and wastewater services? I mean, and that can mean a whole lot of different things, but it's can different groups work together to meet the needs of the customers.
Andy, thoughts on
Yes,
regionalization?
thanks, Brent. Yeah, for us in Camden County, it was an absolute must. Camden County, New Jersey, we had 37 municipalities, 52 wastewater treatment plants. It would cost billions of dollars to upgrade each of those treatment plants, all of which were in non-compliance and discharging, non-compliant effluent into the smaller streams of the county. So for us, it was really a go or no go with respect to, environmental performance and compliance, but also the economic development. The entire county was on sewer ban because of the non-compliance. So the fact that it was so much cheaper to regionalize than to upgrade each individual plant, well, I mean, it was a difference between moving forward or not. So for us, it really saved our county.
Yeah, that was a big success for Camden, Andy. And Bill, I know you spend a lot of time with small communities that are having difficulty with compliance, or having difficulty attracting and maintaining operators. Some of the communities that you work with are, what, 50 meters, 100 meters. They're pretty small. So, tell us a little bit about how EJ has addressed this issue.
Yes, thanks, Brent, for the question. And uh, regionalization can mean a lot of different things. I mean, in our case, we started purely as a rural water provider, which would mean, more of a county focus, non-municipal focus, if you will. And over the 20 plus years that we've been doing this, inevitably what's happened is some of the smaller towns, they need help, whether it's manpower, licensed operators, equipment. So we've kind of have viewed things more from how do we share services that would allow utilities to somewhat stay on their own. So in our case, we do work for about 23 other utilities, both water, wastewater, providing, say, licensed operator services. It can also mean back office services. We do that for several utilities, the billing for them, their books, make deposits, all the things that, larger utilities would routinely do. And then also, construction services is another big area, because again, most of your smaller utilities, may not have a boring machine, may not have a vac truck, these types of things that, they tend to be more expensive. But, in the early part of the conversation, a lot of this has been focused on regulatory compliance and cost.
Mhm.
What we're seeing, at least this is in rural Illinois, is just a manpower crunch because you've got folks. I mean, the audience can see I got gray hair, so I'm not a young man anymore. And so you've got folks that are retiring. And because of that, it's going to put a lot of pressure on the next generation of leaders that are going to come up through the systems. And that's the bigger issue is how do the systems afford from a marketplace standpoint, enough of a budget that can, help have an operator raise their family, do all the things that, life is all about. And so those are, some of the struggles that we see in the immediate area.
Bill,
Hey,
go ahead, Ted.
I was going to jump in there because I think it raises a really good point, and part of it was what Andy started with of that, you know, it saved our county.
Mm,
And unfortunately, too many times the regionalization discussion occurs when you have that kind of crisis. And I
Hmm.
think the more we can talk about it and the more we can have these kind of sessions, which are so important to the industry, is are we going to get to the point that we get to start talking about regionalism without a crisis? You know,
Being
and
proactive.
Absolutely.
and so I think that's really critical that we keep these
Mm,
lines of communication open and we keep these discussions going on because crisis is always going to be reactive and being proactive is so much better. But it's often hard to get people to focus on it without that crisis. But Bill's raising a great point there on the lack of workforce. And if we wait till workforce
mm.
becomes the same kind of crisis as compliance was,
Yeah.
it's gonna be bad because
Yeah.
just because you add all these meters together and you say, okay, you still need workforce. I
Mhm.
mean, if you're doubling the size of your system some way, you need greater workforce. So just waiting till
Mm,
workforce is probably the most dangerous of all for us to wait
mm.
till the end to start having those conversations.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, great point. We've already got some questions coming in. So, we talk a lot about regionalization, regional solutions, consolidation. The C word used to be a bad word. You couldn't talk about it several years ago. But I think increasingly, this is something that, we're seeing a major shift. And the topic of voluntary consolidation is being championed as a practical and necessary solution for all the reasons we've discussed. But there's still a lot of concern about how agencies and regulatory agencies can encourage, the carrot or the stick. And I think there's a lot of concern that if you and there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that mandating consolidation isn't always the most successful way. So, how can regulatory and financing agencies more effectively encourage regional projects?
I think that the most important thing is fiscal transparency, because when we looked at our regional situation and the cost of upgrading each individual plan versus the cost of regionalizing into one plan and then sending the flow to that one plan, was a savings of billions of dollars on a capital basis, and then on an operational basis, hundreds of millions a year. So you're talking about it was just so transparently evident that it had to be done to be cost effective. And so I think what the regulatory agencies can do would be to promote planning studies. The EPA
Mm,
gave us a grant, a 75% grant to do this study, the pros and cons, environmental, capital costs, and operational costs. And that investment of the 75% grant saved, again, hundreds of millions of dollars in annual and billions of dollars in capital costs. So it was a small, it was like funding an oil change to save, an engine replacement. It was, so I think that's the regulatory agency should, and it won't always come out as clear cut as it did in Camden County. So you look at the pros, it would enable a transparent
mm.
analysis of what makes the most sense to do.
Right.
Yeah, really, really good point there, Andy. We got another question here. So, what kind of education and communication is most effective to get stakeholders to be open to regional options? Tad, you and I were talking about this before the program, how some communities, are rivals. They have rival football teams and they, hold grudges or they've got, grudge matches. So, how do you get to the point where communities will begin to talk with each other, and trust is such a major issue as well. So how have you done it there in Arkansas?
Trust does frequently become an issue, and when you have a reputation behind you, it kind of helps build that trust. But I think the communication level and the way you're able to get past that is um, community meetings. I mean, it's just that fast. Now, there's a big debate of how many community meetings should you have? Do you keep having them till you've, reached everybody? And that kind of becomes counterproductive. But I do think that, when you go out and you get past the city council or the existing board and you get into the actual communities and you have that financial transparency that Andy was talking about, people look to it. And so I want to back up just a minute there on the regulatory scheme. I think one that I'm seeing that I'm going, this really works is you tell these communities, okay, you want to stay your own? Well, we will loan you this money
Right.
at whatever percent interest rates available at the time and whatever from the regulatory agencies and what have you. But the carrot I like seeing out there is but if a public water system number will go away,
Hmm.
then that loan is a grant.
Mm,
Mm.
And then that goes into the financial transparency of when you're having these community meetings, you say, you all can stay, you all can be your own thing. If that's really important to this community, you can do that. But for the next 30 years, you're going to have a surcharge on your bill to pay
mm,
this capital cost or whatever. And that's just this one. You got another one coming in 2 years or 3 years or 4 years. But so you can make that decision. Do you want to pay for it and stay on your own? Or do you want to say, hey, maybe this isn't the most efficient way to do this? Plus, we get to keep some money in our pocketbook every month.
Right.
Maybe we really don't care if we have our own private, independent
Right.
a water or wastewater system. And so I
mm.
think that's one areas where regulatory agencies can help. And it also goes back to this diminishing funding. We can't just keep giving grant dollars away
Mm.
like we have since the 1970s. The model is not there. The political support is not there. So we got to figure out a way to get out of that cycle too. And I think that does it.
And the grant funding is certainly drying up as well. Certainly less of it, greater needs and less funding. So,
And the other piece is the operational costs, which were never funded. So again, getting the economies of scale of having fewer systems lowers the annual rate costs as well for ratepayers.
Tad, one thing that you've done in Arkansas, one of the concerns we hear from healthy communities that are being asked to help nearby communities is the impact on the healthy communities' ratepayers, the cost, of having to absorb a financially distressed system. Talk to us a little bit how you have addressed that.
Sure. And what, have you watched a couple of the local city council meetings I've had to go to where they're saying, great things that you're doing out there, what's it costing us? And that really is a concern. And it's an interesting debate in the water wastewater space, because in the electrical space, it's not a question. I
Mhm.
mean, they cost share over different geographic areas and different population densities, have done so for decades, but it seems to be this huge concern
Mm.
in the water wastewater space of, are we cost shifting, which is a that's a you could have a whole nother conference, a whole nother webinar on that. But let's get back. So the way we do it is we say right off the bat is that, this is not going to impact existing rate payers. And then we start looking at and we start working at, how can we bring this system up to standards, up to our standards, to operate it, so that once it's brought up to standards, that O&M cost and Andy was talking about, and the continuing capital cost is more closely aligned with our existing customers. And we do that through a variety of different ways. That the struggling system, we go and ask for grant money, or they pay a surcharge on their bill above our regular rates.
Mm.
So, the kind of O&M for today and tomorrow, they're paying fundamentally the same rate as everybody else. But because they let their system become so in a crisis situation, and there's a charge for bringing that system up to fan, they got to pay that. They got to pay that surcharge. And in different communities, it's different amounts based on the needs of the community. We have systems that are paying a surcharge of $4.85, and we have systems that are paying a surcharge of $152 per month.
Mm.
I mean, now those are wealthy systems that thought they were going to be able to have their own little neighborhood private water system, that they didn't, and then they realized after 15 years they really didn't want to be in the water business, and what they had put in was garbage. And so we said, well, if you want us to operate, you're going to have to raise it up. And so we're not asking communities in an affordability or a depressed income area to pay $152 a month. I just want to make that clear.
Mhm.
You know, these are 7,000 square foot houses with, 10 acres attached.
Mm.
So I mean, it's different, but I think that's how we've been able to demonstrate to existing customers and existing political elements that are around us that we are not rate shifting. As we
Mm.
can, it goes back to that transparency that Andy
Yeah.
was talking about, and that financial transparency.
Bill, we've got a question that's come in specifically for you. When it comes to workforce, some of the communities are doing income surveys to ensure the pay scale is competitive. But how do you consider the differences in benefits across area utilities? Is that an issue for EJ?
Well, in our case, we hire an outside firm to do our compensation plan, which is they come in. Actually, they just came in. They were here about every 3 years. We have them come in, and so it's all based on market rate, that type of thing. In our case, I mean, we do have some cities in our geographical area that want to poach our employees, so we have to be in market, because if we're not in market, we'll lose those to some of the larger neighboring towns.
Mm.
And so that's kind of a bigger motive, is that we don't want to be the poachee. We'd rather be the poacher. But it does, like in our case, and we've gotten some negative feedback on it from smaller towns. Hey, we trained up, nice young man and blah, blah, blah. Then, lose it to EJ as an example. And I mean, that's somewhat always the issue in the marketplace. People are going to go where they can make the most money they can to raise their family. And I don't know how anybody can begrudge that with anybody. However, like I said, in our case, we have an outside firm that comes in and does an income, or basically a wage survey to our area. And of course, they're utilizing some of the AWWA tools and some of these things that are available, again, to benchmark is pay appropriate, is benefits appropriate. So that's kind of, and it's important too for our board that that's done by an outside
Hmm.
firm because then it doesn't look like favoritism. It doesn't look like, I mean, we have pay grades. I mean, it's a very rigorous type thing of how we're doing, pay and compensation. So, but smaller utilities can't afford to have an outside firm come in and do all that. I
Yep.
think that's more resident. I'm sure has someone do that in his, larger utilities. This is a routine thing. So, just part of, I guess you'd say, as utilities gain in scale, these are the types of tools that you do. So
Yeah.
I hope that answers the question.
Yes. Yeah, it does.
If there's somebody out there looking for that and needs one, I think one way to get started is that most of these people that do this, if you participate in the study, if you provide your
Mm.
information, then they'll provide you a copy of the results. And that's kind of the carrot to get people to say, okay, we'll tell you what all we're doing. And so even if you can't afford to get one done, if you can find somebody else that's around you and say, hey, will you survey me and include us in your thing? Many instances, then for participating, you get the copy.
Hmm. Yeah, really good suggestion there, Tad. So, Andy, question for you. Question that's come in: how can larger communities support smaller communities and be prepared to explore regionalization opportunities? In your experience, both at Camden and at Moonshot, how do the larger cities begin to engage? Is it usually forced, on them, or are there kind of more voluntary, volitional acts by the big communities to reach out to small? How do you see that taking place?
I think that there's all kinds of different, it's fact sensitive. I mean, in some instances, it could be a regulatory instance where the larger utility is doing well and there's a smaller community nearby that's not, compliant, and then the regulatory agency, may, push for that instance. In that case, you have to sort of borrow what Tad has been talking about, making sure that, you get, I think there's two ways to make sure there's two things that have to be considered to make sure it's fair. On the one hand, the lesser resource community, when they're joining, someone has to be looking out for them to make sure that the arrangement is fair to them and that
Hmm.
they're getting the same kind of, fair shake that the regular people are getting, like Tab was describing. Conversely, you have to make sure that the larger utility isn't, those people aren't getting sunk with the challenges of the non-compliant community. Another thing that I know, Brent, you've been and Hank have been a big support of this is the need for a regulatory safe harbor for the utility that's taking on the system that was in non-compliance. They can't be hit with a violation day one now that they're the owners of it or operators of it. So I think those kinds of considerations when there's a non-compliance. But ideally, like in the case of Camden, and they were all non-compliant for the most part. And
Hmm.
I think 3 out of the 52 were in compliance, but basically
Wow.
they're nearly all out of compliance. And so the idea there was that it just made sense to bring all of them to compliance. It was significantly less expensive to do that, in a regional way than in a
Mm.
separate one by one way. And the other thing, like both Tad and Bill talked about, I don't know if that was an issue then, but it is now, and certainly in the future, the shortage of expertise and manpower.
Yeah.
There just aren't enough people to go around to especially as things become more technical with cybersecurity and more,
Hmm.
technical, it was much simpler in those days to operate those treatment plants. So I just think all in all, in many cases, regionalization is going to be the most cost effective and operationally effective way to go.
Bill, Andy mentioned safe harbor, and you've had some challenges when you've absorbed some of these distressed systems that are in non-compliance. That's a big issue, isn't it,
Mhm.
for systems that don't want to, be in the radar for enforcement?
Yeah, we had that instance here just about 2, 3 years ago. We took over a wastewater. Well, we took over a small community, and the water was fine, but the wastewater. I mean, within 90 days, we got a violation notice, and I'm like, really, you know? And and the problem once you get these violation notices, it starts this clock and the clock can work against you because you're trying to get funding. Now in the case of this situation, this also gets back to regulatory in Illinois. They had an SRF earmark, well, earmark's the wrong word, but just an outlay or a budget item that if you eliminated an NPDS permit for a non-violating wastewater, there was $1 million available up to that you could access with no leverage requirements. And so what we're actually doing in this particular case, again, this is a smaller town located to another adjacent town. We're going to shut down the wastewater plant and we're going to install basically a lift station with a force main over to the next
Hmm.
town nearby. And then we've gotten into an agreement with that town and we're going to share the costs for treatment. And of course, this gets back to regionalization. I mean, there's
Hmm.
no change in ownership. This is just a sharing of a treatment plant. And I think these are the types of tools. I know, you mentioned earlier in your comments that it seems like we as a public drive to consolidation and then we kind of the wheels fall off, right? Because we don't know what that all means. But I think there's a host of things that we can help each other through partnering. And I would rather have the focus be on those situations where we can jointly help each other. Because again, I believe all boats rise when you start partnering with the neighboring towns. And I just can't say that enough.
Yeah. Bill,
I
you
agree.
mentioned the kind of the interconnection. So that's the one way of consolidation or regional solutions is an interconnect. A question from Marissa has come in. How do you weigh the economic benefits of regionalization against the cost of building and maintaining larger pipe networks? And at what distance does regionalization not net out? Anyone want to take that one on?
I could just
Andy?
have from a direct experience. So in our instance, it really did make sense to eliminate the wastewater treatment plants. In some cases, they all required secondary treatment. In some cases, they would require tertiary because of the small streams that they were discharging into, and that was just cost prohibitive. So the cost of the pipeline to convey the flow, we went as far as 25 miles out to connect communities and to bring them into Camden. And because the cost of the capital cost of the pipeline, basically it lasts for 100 years. There are some operations and maintenance costs, especially for lift stations and that sort of thing, but it's negligible compared to the ongoing O&M costs for wastewater treatment plants. Plus, the other benefit was the environmental benefit of eliminating the discharge into the smaller streams
Mhm.
and sending the flow downstream to where there'd be a river with a much greater assimilative capacity. So
Yeah.
it was environmental, capital, and operational benefits.
Ted, have you seen the
Yeah, see,
economic
if I
benefits?
may, man.
Go
I
ahead,
mean,
Bill. Why don't you go ahead?
yeah, one thing to keep in mind on this is that costs have changed a lot post-COVID.
Yeah.
And in our case, we've noticed pipeline costs that have probably doubled to triple, 2 to 3x in terms of CapEx. So it's something that you've got to look at from a feasibility, economic feasibility, because we used to think of regionalization as connecting everybody, and
Mhm.
today we don't. It,
Mm.
I think the model is probably going to be decentralized. You might have, joint ownership or joint, telemetry and all these types of things. Because we've got technology that can do things. You don't have to physically be connected like we
No,
used to.
that's a good point, and that goes to the question of Christy, who said, "Are all of your areas consolidated, or are some independently working together? How does the trustee boards and control work?" So, talk about that a little bit more. How your boards work and the communities that you absorb or are helping. When you talk to people about consolidation or regionalizing, they're worried about losing control. And how does your model address those concerns?
I don't know, Ted, you want to tackle that or you want me to tackle that?
You can
Or
start.
Yeah, so in our case, we're a co-op, so we're a nonprofit co-op, which means that the members actually own the system. So there is no shareholder, and the municipality doesn't own us either. So our model is pretty simple. I mean, the board's elected, they get a petition each time their term comes up, and if they run unopposed, they somewhat well, just like an election, you run unopposed and you're in for another term. If you are running against someone else, then there's an election process that happens. So we have districts. So the districts make up pretty well a uniform set of population across. In our case, we're in 19 counties. We have 3 districts, and there's 3 members from each district. So we don't
Mm.
have any at large in our case. And so the board's elected, and of course, as an elected board, much like most other governing boards, that's who has ultimate responsibility over the leadership team, myself. And, they're the ones that, set rates, approve budgets, they're doing the things that just most other governing boards, handle. But so if a community comes in to our area, it's pretty well based upon the district that they're in. So for
Hmm.
communities in District 1, they just become part of District 1. The residents now become members. So, they're now a member of EJ Water. And they have a vote. They can go,
So
they
they
have,
can still vote with the others on price increases and those types of
well, in
governance.
our case, they vote for the board, and then the
Okay,
board has that responsibility to handle.
got it.
It's based on our bylaws.
Yep.
Those responsibilities. There's kind of like a membership layer. There's also a board layer of the
Yep.
governance things that are all dictated by, in essence, in our case, the bylaws.
Tad, you're not a co-op, so how does it work? How does the shared governance work in your system?
We're probably unique to everybody else, or no, nobody's unique to everybody else. There's every model that's repeated out there somewhere, but we were basically created by two large cities, and
Hmm.
so but even the size of those cities was disproportionate. So our board has 7 members. 4 must come from Little Rock, and 3 must come from North Little Rock. Now, since that time, we've have other systems that are other cities and other communities that are part of our system, and they do not have representation.
Hmm.
And sometimes that is a problem. The most recent larger consolidation we did, which was they connected with a pipe to our system because it made the most sense. Their very first question was, "Do we get a seat on the board?" And my response was no. And if that's a deal breaker, then let's save everybody some time and money and just go our separate ways.
Hmm.
But it ended up not making sense. Now, will we be able to maintain that forever? I don't know. I really don't think so. I think governance is an issue that we're going to have to tackle at some point. But in that relationship, I mean, we have retail customers, cities that we've brought in and their retail customers. We have wholesale customers. Our wholesale customers have some unique um, uh, arrangements in that there, for instance, there's two, neither one of them is city. They're both just water authorities. They're right next to each other. They both buy all of their water from CAW. And they themselves said, well, wait a minute, we're going to keep our own boards,
Mhm.
but we're going to have an operating board where they each put 2 members up to an operating board, and that board operates both systems. But then separately they set their own rates and what have you down at the 2 separate levels. But all the billing's done by the by the next board up. So that next board up is basically distributing costs between those two systems,
Hmm.
and then those two systems determine what their rates are going to be and how they're going to do it. So there are all kinds of models in there out there to keep people engaged, to keep communities engaged. And the model can be everything from seats on a board or a joint operating committee, or they can even just be, we promise you we're going to come every quarter and we're going to tell you what's going on. We're going to
Hmm.
tell you what the big capital projects are. You can ask your questions. You can say you don't like it. I mean, I think that's the bigger thing is how do you keep the lines of communication open with the communities as these come together?
Yeah.
Um, because the newspapers will control it. We can say all day long that we're going to keep the votes here or there or whatever. But if you go into Community X and the newspaper headline is the residents of X are screaming bloody murder, they don't need a seat on the board. I mean, there's then some work
Good
that's
point.
got to be done to make sure that those customers are understand what's going on and they're aware of it. And even if they don't agree with it, at least they get comfortable with it and say, okay, they're not just out there doing crazy stuff. So, we can talk all we want to about seats on a board, but it's really the newspaper and the television stations.
Yeah, it's about communicating communicating, and also it goes hand in hand with transparency and trust, which we've talked a lot about. So, there's Tad, if I'm not mistaken, your utility was created by state legislators and state legislation. And some of the questions that we have coming in is what recommendations do you all have for state regulators or legislators even on ways that they could incentivize or encourage consolidation, regionalization without making it appear as if it's mandatory. And Tad, Arkansas has done something very unique. I think it's Act 605 that's forcing communities to basically report on their financial health. Is that correct?
Yeah, Act 605, and they just in this, that was a water statute, by the way, and they just this last session passed the same requirements for wastewater utilities. And so it does a couple of things. Depending on the size of your utility, and the frequency, you must have a rate study done. And that rate study has to be done by an approved entity doing rate studies. Communities Unlimited is on that list. We're actually on that list. Ralph, tell us. I mean, you kind of run the
WFX is on that
names.
list.
Pardon?
I said WFX is on
WFX?
that list.
Yeah. I think they are. Are they?
Yeah, we are.
Is that what you're
We
telling
are.
me? So I mean, but it brings some unique things to it because the other thing the act says is once that rate study's done, whatever governing board, you must adopt those rates that
Mm,
make the system financially viable. As a result, it falls back on the study provider to be true and say, okay, this is really what it's going to take to be viable.
mm,
They can't fall. I think what we're finding in the state is that depending on who they're hiring, particularly if it's engineering firms, they want the business so they're not making the local board unhappy. And that's no
mm.
reflection on anybody in particular, but it is a problem there. But
Yeah.
so Act 605 does that, says you got to go have a rate study and then you must adopt those rates. And that's huge
That is
because
huge.
it
That's full
does.
cost pricing, which, has been around for a long time. But that's a tough pill to swallow for a lot of these
It
communities.
is, the one out is that if it's going to increase rates by more than a certain percentage, instead of doing it within the year, you get 2 years to do it. So you can step it up.
Hmm.
It requires board training. It requires every member on a board to actually have 10 hours of approved training by the state regulatory to say, okay, we're really going to make sure, and then the state regulatory agent is laid out. Here are the things that you must be trained on, and you have to use one of these approved trainers
Mm.
who has submitted their training plan to us, and we said, yes, that covers it. So I think that's another way that states can start getting people thinking differently and getting people that it's not mandated, but we're going to provide you a little more education, and therefore maybe it gets the wheels spinning that maybe there is a better way to do this.
Yeah,
And
a little
it and
nudging
it
too.
benefits.
I understand if they don't raise their rates or they don't comply, that they're not eligible for funding
That
future.
is
So
correct.
yeah. So it takes
If
that
the
carrot
SR,
away. So it removes the carrot. Not necessarily a stick, but it's a nudge or taking the carrot away.
There's some
Um,
other
so
things
we
too.
got lots of questions coming in. I'm not going to be able to get to them all, but go ahead, Andy. I'm sorry I interrupted.
No worries. I was going to say, just to pull together what we've been talking about, I'd say there are four things that states and legislators can do. One is to make sure that there isn't any existing legislation that prevents or hampers
Mm,
regionalization, consolidation, that sort of thing. At least make sure there's enabling legislation. And we've already talked about, safe harbors for utilities taking on non-compliant utilities. That's really critical. Funding planning studies. And then the other thing I would suggest is like funding technical assistance to either and or templates, like the template of a service agreement or a shared service
mm.
agreement. So just to make grease the wheels, make it easier for these communities rather than them having to reinvent the wheel, whether it be a full service agreement or a shared service like Bill was describing. Those would be four things that states could do to make it easier for
Yeah,
municipalities.
really good points there, Andy. Well, we still got you. Question came in that says, what advice would you give to towns that are exploring regional partnerships? Where can they start? So many of these communities, they don't even know where to begin. So, there's technical assistance providers out there like Moonshot and WFX and Rural Water and
And our
Communities
cap,
Unlimited, correct?
yeah, and our cap
Exactly.
is.
And RCAP. Yep.
I think it's
Yeah.
just, that's the natural thing is reach out to one of the TA providers
Yep.
and have a circuit rider or, whomever come out and just have an education. It's almost like a lunch and learn, if you will, that casual, because you want a very casual conversation, which would allow for conversation and questions. And it's no different than what we're doing here. Uh, you know, it's just a conversation to start the wheels turning.
I agree with Bill. The key would be to find one of the local TAs or national TAs, that technical assistance advisors, and basically do a cost benefit analysis.
Mm,
It's pretty straightforward. And one thing I really want to double down on something that Bill said earlier is that it isn't like, if someone comes to your house and do you want solar panels on it, yes or no, or a light switch, yeah, it's on or off. There's so many options. You could, yes, do full consolidation and doing,
mm,
nothing, everyone's staying apart. You could have a partial consolidation. It might make sense for this cluster of towns to come together physically. One or two might be too far away, and it doesn't make sense. So they have they stand alone, but have the overarching, governmental services shared, or it could just be a direct shared service. I remember that at our utility in Camden, we needed to get rid of our biosolids, our sludge, and there was a neighboring utility that had spare biosolids disposal capacity, so we had a shared
mm.
service with them to lower our costs. So it could be anywhere between full consolidation and staying up status quo. There's all kinds of options, and that's where I think technical assistance would definitely help to try to help identify the pros and cons of each.
Yeah, really good points. So we do have a question. Obviously, you have private investor-owned companies out there, and you've got municipally owned. One question is there a role for private investor-owned companies in this space? Anyone
I
want
think
to
so.
address that, Andy?
I mean,
Yeah, I definitely. Oh, so go ahead,
I
Bill.
can handle that. I mean, like in Illinois, investor owned, they're in here. And, like if you want to talk like American Water as an example, they've been at this over 100 years. So I think you've got some really good investor owned utilities that really do a pretty good job. I think that they have a role in the place. It depends, in my opinion, humbly, of whatever the local entity wants. I mean, in our case, we've gone up against American Water on like bids, and we've lost, which is it's okay. It's a bidding process. Um, there's issues where I think it makes a lot of sense, and I think there's issues that it may not make as much sense. I think, especially maybe when you're talking about smaller communities, especially, one thing that hasn't been talked about is our business is a very capital intensive, very low margin business. So there's not a lot of wiggle room. There's not a lot of money being made. And the problem is that if you're trying to extract profits, keep in mind too, the investor owns pay taxes. They pay sales tax, they pay income tax. So all those tax, which can be sometimes 20, 30%, that all gets funded through rates. And that's not talked a lot about. Why is their rates higher than say TADs or like our rates? Well, they're paying taxes and we're not. They pay real estate taxes and so I mean my point is their cost structure inherently is a little larger than ours. And then of course they have to return obviously profits back to their owners, and so they tend to also have full cost accounting, so they're going to charge the full cost. And if you're in a system that's not charging the full cost, which a lot of the systems aren't, which kind of gets back to why would you have a 605 in Arkansas? Well, it's because most of the utilities don't have whatever the reasons are, they don't want to charge the full
Mm,
full rate to the ratepayers. So but I believe they have a role, and I'm happy to coexist with those guys, obviously. But I think there are circumstances, especially in smaller towns, that I tend to favor more of an authority like what Tad has in a co-op because I think it's a little bit nimbler. But there's certain size systems that it makes perfect sense, and especially I know like in our case, we have a small system of like 55 customers that we inherited actually out of a TA provider, RCAP. Um, and it's physically next door to investor owned uh, utility. I'm trying to give it to them. When I give it to them, we own like a couple 100,000 in debt. I'm just trying to, because it's hard for us to service it. It's too far away from us.
Hmm. Right.
And so my point is, some of this is just geography. I mean, if you're up in your service area, I mean, I would love to give, referrals to that direction, or even vice versa down in our
Yeah.
areas. But our business is not quite to that level yet,
Yeah. Bill,
where
you talk
we're
about geography. What is the furthest distance of the furthest system away? I mean, at what point does consolidation of regional solutions not work?
Well, it's a lot of it's on density. So population density is
Right.
a major driver to how effective this thing is. In our case, our fleet's driving, our service area, I think is 3,700 square miles. So this is a
Mm,
big area. And we drove 600,000 miles, the fleet did last year. So I buy a new truck every 90 days. And I mean, and we get rid of them around 220,000 miles. So it's not like I'm popping them out every,
mm,
50,000 miles. But my point to raise is that we're learning about, obviously cost, these KPIs is a huge
hmm.
driver. And
It's
so
just it's distance, population, and topography too. Like
Mm,
you have
it is.
big
And so in
hills
our
or
case,
river crossing, that kind of thing.
yeah,
yeah.
we've kind of figured out that about an hour, hour and a half seems to be the distance. Maybe 2 hours, but again, it all depends on population. We remotely dispatch, our workforce, so they don't all come to the mothership, if you will, and we dispatch from
Hmm.
there. So we've been doing that for years. But there is, and this gets back to planning that Andy had mentioned. If you have planning grants, you can somewhat figure this out in terms of population, geography, where the water is, where it's got to go, and also, on the wastewater side of the house. There's some natural geography that should be looked at,
Hmm.
because you don't want to push water uphill, or in this case, wastewater. It's just there's some natural things in watersheds that have to play into this, or should play into it, in my
Yeah.
humble.
No, really great points. Where does contract operations fit into this? There's obviously private companies that, national, but also regional contract operators that, how do they fit into this picture?
I think it makes total sense to use them. In fact, in our public sector wastewater utility in Camden, the regional authority, I contracted out portions of the system that our team did not run well.
Hmm.
And so it's not, again, it's not an all or nothing situation. I think that if you, and so much depends on, also came back to that earlier question about whether the private sector, there's a role for it. And I
Mhm.
totally agree with what Bill said. The most important thing is the capacity of the public sector entity involved. If you have a utility run by like Bill or Tad, a well-run utility, then because of the private sector's need to pay taxes and profit, public sector will always win out a bit. But if you have a very low capacity community, low resource community, then private sector might be the only solution. And again, so much depends on like the topography, the proximity, etc. And so the same thing with the individual system. It could be like, say, our wastewater treatment plant. There was portions of that our operators ran really well, but there were like when we put in a combined heat and power system, there was just no way we had the capacity,
Mm.
technical expertise to be able to run it. So I kind of operated it out. So I think it's very much fact sensitive, but another option that should be considered.
Mhm.
Really
And
good
by the way,
point.
that way you get you can get the best of both worlds if you get a fair contract because you keep ownership, you keep your name on the water tower, so to speak. But again, what's really critical is making sure that there's technical assistance available to less resource communities so that they get a fair deal out of it because they may not have the ability to know and see loopholes and that kind of thing.
Agreed. Yep, agreed. We've got a number of questions that have come in, again, on kind of emphasizing the economic benefits. If there's useful data from your systems, or if it's anecdotal, I don't know if it's empirical, any data that confirms the economic benefits of consolidation or regionalization in your cases. So Andy, I mean, was there economic? It seems like there would have to be
It's
economic benefit.
huge. So the cost back in the 19 late 80s, early 90s dollars was $300 million to regionalize versus $1 billion to upgrade each individual system. That was
Wow.
it was like a three, and then even though the cost obviously would go up by inflation, it was still 3x apples to apples. And then the annual the annual operating cost from operating one treatment plant versus 52 was like literally 30 to 35 times
Wow.
lower
No.
because
Okay.
each of those individual plants required a certain number of operators, and then that doesn't even count the overhead, like doing what Bill's doing and
Mhm.
Tad in his way, where you have one central management team as well. So
Mm.
the cost savings were just incredible. We had 50 different treatment plants, but my point is that more often than not, unless there's some topographical reason, like Bill's and I were describing earlier, it's almost always going to be more cost effective to regionalize.
Mhm.
Tad, would you say the same
No,
thing?
yeah, I would say the same thing. And in fact, that cost, particularly on capital improvements, is the easiest conversation to have with communities. As long as there's density, and I think it's come out a couple of times, and one of the questions came out about what's the different economics between when you connect them or um, when you do not connect them. And it is a straight mathematical equation of number of miles you got to go and then the number of meters that are going to be at the end of that mile.
Mm.
I mean,
Interesting.
and if you got to go a long way and there's not enough meters, then it makes sense to operate them separately. If you're going a short distance or even a longer distance, but there's a whole lot of meters, it makes sense to put them together.
Mhm.
And I think it's an oversimplification, but that's the way, if you say, when do you decide? That's, that's the equation. But yeah, it's a big step for people to do that. And I think there's lots of different ways to look at it.
I mean,
Yeah,
distance, population, and topography are the
Yeah.
big
yep.
three.
Well, and also one thing we haven't mentioned, obviously, is local, raw water quality,
Oh,
because,
yeah.
Mm.
like in our case in Illinois, we just don't have a lot of groundwater, available groundwater. So typically, what happened is big surface water plants, which would kind of act more like the big electric plants, they came in because, when you start talking about a surface water and then you have a relationship with, say, a core lake, little towns can't that math
Mm.
don't work out. And so, to a certain degree, because of our raw water in our particular area, it led into, if you will, or leaned itself into more regionalized approaches. Now,
Mm.
there's pockets of groundwater where, little towns have been able to survive on them, if you will. But, raw water, it can be a driver, depending on where it's located and what the situation is within different geographies in our
Yeah.
nation.
Bill, I want to pick up on that um, topic of raw water. Obviously, the water crisis in Flint raised a lot of concerns about different water sources. And so when you do consolidate, in many cases, these communities are receiving water from a different source. You
Mhm.
guys bumped into an issue early on. I think, nationally, there's heightened concern about leaching of lead from different water sources. So how have you all addressed that issue?
Well, I mean, you're talking of corrosion control, and that was, at least in Illinois, primacy put in place because of Flint. That analysis never took place, unfortunately. And, I mean, we all know the aftermath of it, which is, I don't know what even word to say on that, but we as an industry have had to become more sensitive about changing, from either a surface water to groundwater, vice versa, whether you're running chloramines or open, disinfection, and even disinfection byproducts. But the whole thing has just changed. I mean,
Mm.
what we used to do 10, 15, 20 years ago was pretty easy. Today, it's a whole different animal. So it's something that obviously we look at in a we have to, because it's regulatory, but also we want to do a good job, as we've learned, on how this all works. And so it gets very involved. And in some cases, now we haven't had one yet that hasn't worked, but for the most part, it is a process, and it can delay connecting the town up to a year, almost 2 years, to do, pipe loop studies and desktop studies. And it all depends on the drivers of, like, what the raw water is, how aggressive is it, how is the treatment, how aggressive does the treatment have to change? And of course, the legacy part of it is the town, what's the pipes, what does all that look like? So, I
Mm.
mean, I hate to not answer the question, but it's rather complicated.
Yeah. Yeah. No, definitely it's not always the easiest path forward, but so we got a few minutes left here. Another question has come in. It's how can communities, what are some other partners? We talked about TA providers, but can counties and councils of government, COGS, play a role in supporting communities that are pursuing regional solutions? Tad, is that been an idea or an option in Arkansas?
It has, and it's been as people, particularly post-COVID, actually, as people moved, they want their 5 acres of heaven, and moved out of the dense or areas. Counties have been trying to figure out how are we going to meet this water demand that's there because there's wells, and Arkansas is a water-rich state, so we get to deal in that thing. But a lot of people are city folks moving out of the county, and they don't know how to run a well. And I mean, there's these aspects of it, and so counties are having to look at it. And I think they can be important players and in the regionalization effort and in protecting public health to make sure that we're providing outstanding water supplies.
Mm,
So there is a role there. The really interesting challenge that I think that is coming up for larger growth, regional groups is do they want to get into that business?
mm,
I mean, yeah, I mean, does a new community, does a new area want to be in that business? And I think that's the one of the interesting things that has to be when we talk about these regionalisms or what you do. You mentioned Act 605, and Act 605 says they cannot issue a public water system number to anybody with less than 300 that's going to have less than
mm.
300 connections.
Interesting.
To keep now that's a pretty low number.
It
You're
is.
not going to you're not going to convince me that there are any economies of scale with a system that's 500 connections.
Yep.
I mean, but at least they put something in there,
Right.
and so, but I think that's more the big question that ought to be coming is there are unserved areas. And as we look at those unserved areas, are they looking in a way to say, do we really want to, is a big system the way to do this? Is this the way they did it in
Mm.
1978, the way to do it? And so I think that's a bigger role for counties or other larger governmental entities to start thinking about is this something we really want to do?
Right.
And then what's the most efficient way to do it?
Good question. I want to give you all, each of you, a chance to make final concluding remarks. But before I do, I just want to remind those that have dialed in today that this is the first in a series of discussions on regionalization. And we'll have two more over the coming months. One talking about the state funders, and another talking and regulators, what this means to regulators, but also on technical assistance providers, which we've mentioned today. But I'm going to give each of you a chance to make, one recommendation. You can pick a state legislator or a state regulator or a community on one word of advice that you would give to them today, concluding on those that are interested in pursuing regional solutions. So it looks like Bill's got one. Tad's thinking about it, but Bill, what would you say?
I mean,
And let us know who you're targeting. Is it a state regulator, legislator, or community?
well, it's probably more of a community. Um, and this is something that I haven't mentioned yet on this webinar, but we've done several acquisitions, and I think somewhere in the area of 25 to 30. So this is it's a fair amount. And so
Hmm.
we've learned a lot. I think we've only had two failed mergers or acquisitions. So we know what that feels like, and we know what it looks like, and we know why it failed, more importantly. But I think too, success, if you don't start dissecting like why is it working too, you don't understand how to fix it. Or at least
Mm.
that's what we somewhat talk about around here. So what I'm leaning into is focus groups. So we've done some focus groups on some towns that we've acquired, and we would invite, some ratepayers in and say, hey, let's just, talk. And, it was casual. But mainly what I was after was how did it feel to them? And I'm using feel as an emotion because oftentimes this is not a business decision. this is more about emotions and perceptions and what people think versus, balance sheets and P&Ls and engineering
Mm,
study. Because all that stuff is important, don't get me wrong, but oftentimes, especially for elected officials that have to make these decisions, it's all based upon, someone's upset or someone called or
mm,
someone doesn't like it and blah, blah, blah. So I guess my point is, through these focus groups, one of the surprising things that I just blew me away was the ratepayers really didn't care who sent their water bill to them. They didn't care
Still
who.
mine, Bill.
I But even in my case, I think, oh my gosh, they love EJ. But the reality is people just want, and this was another piece of what we ended up doing through a focus group. We've done it a couple times. What people told us, they want water quality and they want reliability of service.
mm,
Those are the two main drivers. It wasn't rates. I mean, I
mm.
know conversations about rates, and I'm not saying rates aren't important, but in our garnered 19% of the respondents was rates, or at least a sense of
Interesting.
affordable rates. And so I'm kind of shifting the conversation a bit to say it's really about water quality.
Mm,
It's really about reliability, and I
mm,
think we as a sector need to think in those value proposition terms because I think that's what makes the difference. Not saying that rates aren't important,
mm,
but it's just something to keep in mind from a community level that the
mm.
ratepayers honestly don't care as much as you think they do.
Tad, closing thoughts.
Well, I was going to say ratepayers don't care, but I think the other thing we have to think about is we have to don't look for the answer today. What's the solution need to be in 2050, 2060,
Yeah,
2075? Water infrastructure, everything we do is long life, high cost, long term. So don't do your analysis for tomorrow. Do your analysis for the next
mm.
generation
Great
and
advice.
look at how that what that looks like.
Great advice. Andy, last but not least,
Thanks,
closing
Brent.
thoughts.
I think my message would be to state regulators and legislators to look in your state and see where there are communities where low income and non-compliance are intersecting and commission studies or look for studies to see can they join someone? Can they have a shared service with someone? Is there a way to make sure that every community is in some sort of a safe harbor? Either they're self-sufficient themselves, which is great, then they can decide if they want to do something better with respect to economies of scale. But if they aren't complying and they have low income, then can we find a safe harbor for them to connect into, or merge a group of them together to get that economy of scale?
Mm,
So I think my thing would be that legislators and regulators should be proactive in looking for these unserved areas or underserved areas and try to make sure that they have some kind of coverage.
yeah, great advice. Well, gentlemen, I thank you for sharing your time and your wisdom today. This has been a very informative conversation, and I appreciate those who have dialed in. And we're excited to continue to have this conversation and encouraging more communities and states to seek out regional solutions. So, gentlemen, thank you again for your time.
Thanks a lot, Brent.
Thank you.
Thanks,
I
Thank
Tad.
enjoyed
you.
it.
Bill,
Take care.
take
Thanks,
care.
everyone.
Bye.